Hi, everybody. Um, I can see we've got 28 people in the meeting today, which is fantastic. Thank you for coming along. My name's Justine Holmes, and I am the State Facilitator for EstuaryWatch and WaterWatch. I'm based out of the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority, and today I'm coming to you from Wadawurrung Country in Torquay. But I work at the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority that works not just on the Wadawurrung country, but on the lands of the Kulin Nation and the Kirai-Wurrung, Jagud-Wurrung, Gulidjan and the Gadabanud people of the Maar Nation, and we acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today, we're going to be hearing from Darren Cottam from the EPA, who will be talking to us about two E.coli projects. And they'll be from Melbourne. And then we're going to hear from Juliet Feuvre about the history of E.coli in Wye River and where that project is at the moment. I just wanted to say that EstuaryWatch and WaterWatch don't actually test for E.coli, but I do want the program to facilitate learning and hearing from communities who have waterway pollution. And I thought this webinar could be used as a useful tool for other communities who are facing similar issues. I also want to point out that most of you are on mute and the cameras are turned off except for a select few. And I've done this so it can make the session smoother to run. But if you have questions throughout the session, if you can pop them in the chat and I will get to them at the end of the presentation. But if your microphone isn't muted, would you mind muting it now before I hand over to Darren? I'll give you a little bit of an intro about Darren. He works at the Environmental Protection Authority in Victoria, and he's the program coordinator for water. He coordinates the operational delivery of EPA's recreational water quality programs for the Beach Report and the Yarra Watch. And he's a lead on policy, research and development, and projects to enhance recreational water quality science and communication. And he's led the water quality monitoring and assessment after the 2022 Victorian floods. He has 16 years experience working in recreational water quality in Victoria, and he also contributes to the emergency response under EPA's supporting agency role in emergencies. So I'll hand over to you now, Darren.
Thanks, Justine. Good that I remember to take my mute off. I don't always do that these days. So if you just bear with me, I will share my screen and my presentation. I will hopefully get that up and running. Can you see my screen? Oh, cool. That's good. I'll get this up and running then. Okay, I might just get rid of that part. Cool. Well, thanks, Justine, for the invite to the webinar, and always welcome the opportunity to talk about recreational water quality with people who have an interest or who work in this space. Essentially, as Justine said, I work at EPA, so my focus of my role is recreational water quality. So it's good to be here today. I'll just try to change slides. I will give people a little bit of a warning that sometimes my computer is a bit slow at changing slides. But anyway, so today, in today's presentation, I won't read through all these bullet points, no doubt you can read them yourselves, but essentially this is what I'll cover. My focus will be on really kind of just talking about recreational water quality in a general kind of nature. So, what needs to be considered for recreational water quality monitoring, and also what needs to be considered in terms of managing the risks to recreational waters if they're not meeting the standards for primary or secondary contact, i.e. swimming or canoeing, kayaking, that type of thing. But I will also be talking about what we do at EPA. So I guess it's a very kind of general or a general presentation on recreational water quality, giving a bit of an introduction, and I won't be kind of talking specifically about Wye River. So look, in terms of recreational water quality, and the focus really here is microbial water quality. I won't be talking about algal blooms or anything else. A first port of call for anyone who's kind of interested in the space or is kind of working in the space is the Environment Reference Standard we have in Victoria, which kind of sets out standards for, basically protecting water bodies for a whole range of things. It has standards for recreational water quality, particularly microbial water quality. And so it recommends if you're doing sampling of a water body for recreation, it might be it's used for recreation. You take samples for E. coli or enterococci, depending on the type of water that you're sampling. So I might just see if I can get my little laser pointer up and going. Hopefully you can see that. So essentially, this is a table that I've taken out of the Environment Reference Standard, which I'll refer to as the ERS from here on in. And so it kind of gives you some guidance on what indicators to use. So for freshwater systems like rivers, for example, you can use E. coli or enterococci, but for marine and estuarine systems, it's recommended that you use enterococci. And in the standards, it sets out the levels at which you can assess your samples against. So anything that's not that's above these levels, essentially, is you starting to get increasing risk to people who are going for swims, essentially. And this is short-term. This is our short-term table for the microbial indicators, enterococci, E. coli, and the objectives. So you use these numbers essentially for assessing a single sample that you've collected at a site. So that's what's in the ERS. So it's a good starting point. There's also long-term objectives, which are more about long-term management of water quality and recreational waters, but you need a minimum of 60 samples, ideally 100, and you can't do that assessment annually type of thing. So I haven't really covered that here, but this is probably the essential kind of information. In terms of why is E. coli enterococci used? So in the ERS, it's really aligned with the national standards for recreational water quality. So E. coli enterococci are recommended at national level and internationally. So the World Health Organization recommends them. So they're used all around the world for rivers, beaches, you name it, essentially. And the reason for that is that they're relatively cheap to get analyzed, samples analyzed for these indicators. Lots of commercial labs do the analysis, but primarily they're good at indicating if there's pathogens or viruses in the water that could cause you to get ill. So you may not necessarily get ill if you're exposed to E. coli or enterococci, but they are indicators that there's other nasty bugs in the water, essentially. And these pathogens and viruses, I mean, they come about in terms of from fecal pollution in the water. Essentially, that's what's causing these pathogens and viruses to be in the water, and that's what's causing the risk to people who get exposed to it. So that's why we recommend them, essentially. In the ERS, it's not just about water sampling, though. It's also recommended that you do sanitary inspection at each site, and we do that in Melbourne at sites we cover for beaches in the Yarra River, and I'll go into a bit more detail a bit further on. But yeah, it's important to do a sanitary inspection, which is like a risk assessment of the potential fecal sources in your catchment or foreshore, and it helps you to better understand what fecal sources may be causing the E. coli or enterococci that you're seeing in your sampling results. There's a lot of info in this table, so I'll try to talk through it, but I won't spend too much time. I've got some nice red boxes I've put up. So you may remember there was like a level of 260 and 200 for, sorry, 260 for E. coli, 200 for enterococci. So once you start to get above those levels in your sample results, you start to get an elevated risk of people potentially getting ill, and you can get ill from a single exposure. So you hop in the water once, you can get sick. These percentages, one I'll focus on is the GI, gastro, essentially. So once you start to get to these levels, you start to get a 5% or higher chance of getting ill from a single exposure. And so that's why we do the sampling around microbial water quality. With other contaminants, you need long-term exposure, not just a single exposure. This would be, don't be too distracted by this number here. This is really kind of over 5%. This number here, this percentage is based on all pathogens, viruses in the water, whereas this has just been done based on one, Campylobacter. But also once you take into account all the pathogens and viruses, it would be over 5% risk of getting ill per single exposure. But anyway, the indicators are really good because they're linked to health risk, which is important. So that's one of the reasons that we use these indicators essentially. So at EPA, we do monitoring and water quality management for a couple of recreational water quality programs, Beach Report and EstuaryWatch. So this is a map just off the website for these programs. So Beach Report's been going for over 30 years. EstuaryWatch has been going since 2005, and it's a partnership with Melbourne Water. So in the map here, you can see we cover 36 beaches around Port Phillip Bay. Melbourne is just there, Geelong, Mornington Peninsula. You have the Yarra River here, so EstuaryWatch covers that. So we do weekly sampling of E.coli in the river, and then enterococci, which is the best indicator for marine waters at the beaches, essentially. So we do it weekly during summer. These actually go all year round. So outside of summer, we do fortnightly sampling because it's not the peak season. The primary information we put out to the community is water quality forecasts. So good, fair, poor. And it's all we have these forecast models, water quality forecast models set up that predict the risk of stormwater pollution. So that's really rain and stormwater pollution, or the runoff is really a good way of predicting whether you're going to get high or low levels of E.coli or enterococci. So that's what the models focus on. You can't really predict dry weather pollution. It's a little bit more difficult. And in terms of, we put this out on the website, Twitter, Facebook, all that type of stuff. We have an SMS subscription service as well. And look, if we go in our weekly sampling, if we get high results that's not related to rain, then we'll issue some advisories or investigate, because the forecasts really cover off on the wet weather conditions. They'll predict in advance and give people warning in advance if there's going to be rain impacting water quality. But dry weather pollution is not something that should be happening. We expect good water quality during dry weather. We do other type of monitoring. So yeah, we are a supporting agency in emergency response. So we'll consider going out and doing sampling during those really high risk periods during emergency events, so floods and bushfires primarily. So this map is just from some work we did during the October 2022 Victorian floods. So we're coming into a warmer period, October, November into December. So we're doing sampling at 25 sites around Victoria and communicating that to the community, essentially. And then from January 2023, we did a 6-month assessment at these sites to see how they recovered after the floods. So that's some other work that we sometimes do in emergency response capacity. But yeah, overall, that's the work that we do in the monitoring space. Obviously, we do other work around the science side of things, R&D policy, and other projects to enhance all of that. And at APA, we also do compliance type work around businesses or other activities that may be impacting recreational water quality as well. So in terms of sampling, we collect samples, take them to a commercial lab, which is NATO accredited. So there's a guarantee of the quality of the analysis that's done, and we can be confident of the results that we get. And these are the different types of methods. I won't go into them in any kind of great detail, but this still tends to be taking a sample, taking it to the lab, still tends to be one of the most common ways of doing this type of monitoring. But there's also new technology that's kind of coming on board. I'm not trying to sell or promote any of these businesses, but these are the ones which are used, I'm aware of, that are used in Victoria or are going to start to be used. And so these are devices that you can use where you can take a sample, put them into these devices, and it will analyze the samples for you. You don't need any specialist skills or knowledge. You don't need a lab, anything like that. And they generally speaking get results back faster than the laboratories. It takes 24 hours to get a result back from a lab. If you have a really high E.coli or enterococci result, these devices can get you back a result in 4 to 6 hours. It does take longer if the E.coli or enterococci result is lower. It will take longer than that. And also the companies who have these devices, they've done their side-by-side comparisons with the labs in terms of the results they get from these devices in the lab, and they generally speaking perform quite well. But the men are not cheap to buy or hire as well. But they are cheap to do samples on an individual basis. But you've got to actually purchase or hire the device in the first place. We use Tector at EPA for emergency response. So obviously labs are not always open on weekends, or if there's something happening out in the regional Victoria where labs are not close by, then these are very handy. So we use these in emergency response. Also, I'm aware of Alpine Shire for the Upper River pools. Also, in their weekly summer monitoring, they use Tector as well because they're not that close to a lab, essentially. Fluidian, from my knowledge, is a little bit newer, and it's going to be trialled at a lifesaving club in Victoria this summer. They're hiring a device. So just thought I'd kind of talk about sampling in general, and use of labs, use of devices, and in what ways, I guess, the way technology is moving, and maybe in the future, hopefully, we'll get technology which will allow faster turnaround times rather than having to wait 4 or 6 hours or 24 hours. So when you're doing recreational water quality monitoring and managing risks to those recreational waters, you need to you do your sampling, do sanitary inspections, but you need to have a good understanding of fecal sources which are driving E.coli and E.coli and enterococci. So this diagram gives you a little bit of ideas. Also, there's different sources that can be contributing, also humans, various range of animals depending on where you are, essentially. I guess it's important to understand that not all of these sources of fecal pollution, i.e. poo, not all of them are kind of equal in terms of health risk. Also, human sources like sewage is the highest risk if you're finding that in a water body. I should say there, but also cows actually. Cows are similar to human in terms of health risk. If you're finding a lot of cow poo and contamination in a waterway, then that's a high risk for people who are coming in contact with that waterway. And also there can be a range of animals though. So obviously you can get more naturally occurring animals like birds and native animals which are contributing. But there also are certain, so some sources in terms of managing risks is more about probably communication. There's probably not too much you can do about native animals, for example, and then there's other sources where there should certainly be management actions and mitigation. So certainly human sources in particular, because they're such a high risk to people who are a bit exposed to that water. So it's important to have that understanding and know what the sources are in your catchment. In the Environment Reference Standard, has these recommends E.coli, enterococci, and has these levels associated with them. It assumes that 100% of the sources are human in all water bodies in Victoria. It's very conservative to protect public health. So that's where it becomes quite useful to try to understand, well, what are the dominant sources and what other sources are there that are contributing, and they'll kind of indicate to you what potential health risk is and what type of mitigation may or may not be needed, essentially. Other considerations when you're managing risk is it's good to understand from your data set. So you've got done this E.coli and enterococci sampling, and you've got some sample results, so a range of could be for 1 summer, 2 summers, whatever it might be. It's good to understand, are you getting high results not meeting standards for primary contact, i.e. swimming? Are you getting those high results during or after rain, or is it happening during periods where there's no rain at all, i.e. it's not associated with rain? So I think it's important to understand that, to put some context around the results you're getting. Also, if it's being rain, you're probably going to get less people exposed. People generally speaking, don't go swimming when it's raining, or you get cooler temperatures around those times as well. So you got that lower risk of exposure. And in terms of managing risk, at sites where there is recreational water quality, often there's advice about not swimming 2 or 3 days after rain, and that tends to be the main way of managing risk in terms of high E.coli, for example, during wet weather or just after. I'm not saying don't manage stormwater pollution. It's just that it's a lot more complex to try and manage the risks from stormwater pollution. So communication quite often is the way that we manage the risk around that. If you're getting results, if you look at your data set and you can E.coli, enterococci, which are not related to rainfall, that's really probably the first thing to kind of focus on. So understand that in the first place, and then that's where you kind of focus your energies. And also, those are the periods when people are more likely to use a recreational water body. So that's another good rationale for looking at your data set a bit more closely. And also during dry weather, you can get a whole range of sources and causes of pollution. So it can be a little bit complex when you look at that. So that's where things like sanitary inspections can come in quite handy, which is leading into this slide. So basically, we've done sanitary inspections for all the beaches and the Yarra River, and something we always recommend if people are doing sampling, that you need to have a sanitary inspection to understand your foreshore, your catchment. This screenshot here is just one little bit of the form. So we do have a template with a guide, which you're happy to share with anybody, essentially. But what it does, it takes you through all the different potential sources, has different sections for these, and you look at, you basically understand, is it present, not present, what's the state of it, what's the the likelihood of it happening, the consequence, all sorts of information essentially, and you will get a score, come up with a score for each one, and it'll give you a category. Your site's either going to be high, medium, or low in terms of how susceptible it is to fecal pollution. And then you have this information about, well, what potentially are the highest risk sources, and again, it's good to have that background, and also it might kind of guide you on where there's a need to do any mitigation or who you should talk to. The photo on the right is just a staff member doing one out near a beach, and one of these ones is toilet facilities, so that's potentially a risk. So we have a look at how modern is it well maintained. In a worst case scenario, you might go there, it might be really old, it might be signs of overflows, leakages, it's not maintained at all, which could potentially be a risk. It might be really, really close to the beach, stuff like that. So that's the type of nature of the work you do. It's quite simple to do, to follow the template and the guidance, but it's certainly, I think it's a good approach in addition to sampling. And look, if you've got a water body which is not indicators, so E.coli and E.coli are not meeting the standards, then you've done a sanitary inspection. You may or may not decide to go to the next step and take samples for source tracking or microbial source tracking. And there's different tests out there, so I won't go into all of them. That's probably a whole another presentation in itself. But I'll talk about the ones that we use at EPA at least, and the ones we use at EPA are very focused on fecal pollution, so detecting if there's poo, essentially. And so the first one I'll talk about is the library dependent method. So what this is, we refer to as source tracker or community profiling, but what it is essentially is you have a lab, you take a sample, you've got to take it back to a lab, but the lab will have a library of fecal sources. So they've gone out and taken sources of different types of poo all over the place, essentially, and they have a library. And so you're going to take your sample at a beach or a river, you'll take it back to the lab, and they'll basically compare it to their library, and they'll be able to determine what's the percentage breakdown of different sources and what are the dominant ones at your site. And so that's the benefit of this approach. I mean, they'll tell you what's part of it is, you do that, ideally do that if you take a sample for E.coli or enterococci and a sample for this source tracking. And then you can kind of see, well, what's the dominant source driving the E.coli on that occasion or for that summer. And then is it dominant human, dominant dog, etc., etc. And what are the other sources? So it's quite handy from that perspective. I mean, there's always disadvantages with all testing, including E.coli and enterococci, of course. But with the disadvantages in this case is that, you've got to collect the sample and then take it to a lab who will do this type of analysis. And it tends to be quite expensive. Source tracking is not necessarily a cheap thing to do. When you do like a coli and enterococci, it generally costs $30 to $50 to do an analysis on a sample. So it's not too bad. These tend to jump up in cost quite a bit. And for this particular type of analysis, it's, you've got to ideally do quite a few, reasonable number of samples in order to be cost effective, but it's still quite expensive to do, essentially. The other one is a library independence method, which targets the genes in human sewage. So HF183 Bacteroides is something else we use. This is just focusing purely on the human sewage. It's not looking at other type of sources of animals, cows, dogs, bats, whatever it might be. So obviously I've talked about it in other slides that human sewage shouldn't really be occurring, and we know it's the highest risk for human health. So that's why you might do this type of test that's very targeted, essentially. Again, disadvantages, it won't tell you about other fecal sources. So there might be other fecal sources which are dominating in that water body, not human. So I won't necessarily tell you that. And again, you've got those whole logistics and costs around doing source tracking, sampling, and tests, essentially. And this is the final slide. So look, I started off talking about the water quality standards in the area, so the environment reference standard. I thought I'd finish talking about that. So I've said before, it's, they are really conservative for protecting public health. They assume that, this human sewage is the 100% source in all water bodies. So it is quite conservative. It's quite hard to meet those standards for a lot of water bodies around Victoria. So we're trying, EPA, we're doing work to move towards what we call a site-specific standard. So this is basically standards which are more about health risk from local fecal sources at your water body. So not just assuming it's all human everywhere, essentially, because there might be some water bodies where it's just animals, for example, or there's not much in the way of human source pollution. So we're still working on this, we're moving that direction. So that would involve doing your E. coli enterococci sampling, but you're semi-regularly doing some source tracking sampling as well to determine what is the sources, the dominant ones behind E. coli or enterococci, because they obviously, those indicators alone don't tell you the source. This is a table I put together just to try to help people understand it a little bit more. But obviously, this new approach would be you'd still do your standard inspection, still do your coli, enterococci levels, but you do some semi-regularly source tracking sampling as well, and with the aim of it telling you what's the dominant source. Now the order of magnitude here, we're still actually doing work on trying to determine what is the health risk of these different animal sources relative to human. So that is work we're still doing. So this is just an example, but we'll be able to actually populate this table once we've done that work. But essentially the current standards assume it's all human, essentially. So that's why we've got 200 enterococci, 260 E. coli, quite conservative levels. But in the future, site-specific standard approaches that, you'll hopefully in water bodies we'll be able to determine what the dominant source is, which generally speaking, animals tend to be lower risk, health risk, in which case E. coli or enterococci levels won't be as strict based on the health risk associated with a dominant source. So if there's low health risk and if the dominant source is animals, native animals, and we determine those are low health risk, then your levels for E. coli might be 1,000 rather than 260 if you've got a water body dominated by human sources, as an example. So this is the direction we're trying to move to, essentially. And I think I'll leave it there. I'll kind of stop sharing my screen, and if people got any questions.
Thanks, Darren. What I might do is, I think we'll get people I had the chat accidentally turned off when we started, so the chat is now turned on, and we have had one question put in there. But if you've got other questions, put them in now, and then once we get to the end of Juliet's presentation, then we'll read them out to the both of you. But yeah, thank you so much for presenting. It's really good to hear from the perspective of the EPA and on the projects that you're working on. So what I'll do now is I'm going to introduce Juliet Feuvre, and Juliet is going to talk to us about her project in regional Victoria from Wye River. Juliet is the Vice President of the Wye River Separation Community Association, and she's also a WaterWatch and EstuaryWatch volunteer. She spent many years as a Healthy Rivers campaigner with Environment Victoria and is a board member of Environmental Justice Australia. She's a founding member of both the Concerned Waterways Alliance of community groups committed to protecting and improving the health of rivers and wetlands in southern Victoria, and the Lifeblood Alliance of similar groups across the Murray-Darling Basin. Juliet, are you?
Yep, ready to go.
Oh, fantastic. We can see your presentation, so ready to go.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Justine, for the invitation, and thank you, Darren, for that really informative presentation. There's stuff in there I wish we'd known when we started this project. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadibanad people as the traditional owners and custodians of Wye River and Separation Creek. We acknowledge their ancestors who care for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Wye River is a beautiful place. For those of you who don't know it, It's a small town on the Great Ocean Road between Lorne and Apollo Bay, a popular holiday spot, much loved by locals and visitors alike. The Community Association has been in existence since the 1930s, believe it or not, with the simple purpose to advance the welfare and protect the environment of Wye River and Separation Creek. The township takes its name from the beautiful Wye River, a practically pristine stream that flows down from the Otways. It's said to be named after Wye River in the UK, but the traditional owners, and I noticed Richard's on the call, he told me this story, think it could be a different story. There's several places in the Otways beginning with we, such as Wielagta or Wiaparinia. So it could be that we, or Wye, means river in the lost Gadabinad language. We'll never know, but it's certainly intriguing. Whatever the origin of its name, the Wye River is well loved, both in its upstream reaches in the forest and the national park, even more so when it gets down into the township and the Big Four holiday park, and then on to its estuary as it crosses the beach and heads out to the sea. The estuary is a really popular spot for swimming, paddling, sandcastle building, and just plain mucking about. This is my grandson enjoying it to the full. But unfortunately, it's not all a bed of roses. Our estuary has been regularly closed for swimming due to poor water quality with high bacterial content, as Darren's just been describing. The town has no main sewerage, so there are many potential sources of contamination, and the population shoots up from a few hundred over winter to several thousand in school summer holidays, when holiday homes and the Carradine parks are at peak capacity. But as we shall see, there's been little monitoring and even less investigation of where the pollution is coming from. The community has been concerned and baffled by the question of how such a beautiful river in an iconic location in one of Australia's premier tourist destinations could become so polluted. We've been doing our bit. We've had an EstuaryWatch group since 2014. Several members are on the call today, with photo point monitoring at the estuary as it meanders across the beach. A water watch group soon followed, and we've been carrying out monthly monitoring at 2 sites for the past 8 years. But as others have said, we can't test for bacteria, although our water quality is generally fair to good. The Community Association has been worried as well. And in 2019, we held a river summit. Here's what we said at the time, and I'm quoting from the meeting notes. The purpose of the River Summit is to bring all authorities together to have a robust discussion that can clarify the specific roles and responsibilities that can have a positive impact on the long-term health and quality of the Wye River and to counteract the increasing pressure of human impacts on the natural environment. Our overarching question was this: which authority has overall control of water quality in our river? And the answer, not one authority has overall charge. Corangamite CMA, to their great credit, is the conduit for community to agencies and to assist in improving river health. Despite our best efforts, the water qualities have continued. Colac Otway Shire have been monitoring for bacteria, Enterococci and E.coli for some years now, and began publishing the data on their website in the summer of 2018-19. As a result of the testing, this sign, no swimming, started appearing all too frequently, and the estuary has been closed for swimming at least once every year. Last summer, in 2023-24, Colac stepped up their testing to weekly in peak season. The results were quite alarming. I've got the same limits that Darren described in his presentation. For Enterococci, it's 200 mil per organisms per 100 mil, E.coli 260. And you can see there's an awful lot of red on this table where levels exceeded those limits. 7 out of 11 samples exceeded the trigger point for Enterococci, and 9 out of the 11 samples exceeded the trigger point for E.coli. You see the highest reading is 24,000 organisms per 100 mil, mid-January, peak season, well, way above those thresholds for illness that Darren was describing. And that particular result was not related to rainfall. There'd been no rain in the preceding few days. The upshot of all of this, of course, is that our estuary was closed for primary contact recreation, that's swimming and paddling, for most of the summer season. The situation is quite unacceptable to the community. So, about 12 months ago, the Community Association decided it was time to do some testing of our own. We wanted to know where the pollution was coming from, and nobody else seemed to be interested in working it out. All that was happening was that the no swimming sign was going up with increasing frequency. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to all that fancy stuff that Darren's just been talking about, but we did know about environmental DNA testing and that it could be used as a tool for tracking sources of contamination. And the cost was coming down to affordable levels for associations such as ours to at least do some preliminary testing. We weren't setting out to answer all the questions, but we wanted to get a bit of a handle on it. We've been trained to collect eDNA samples for the Great Victorian Platypus Survey, and prior to that with the CCMA project with Deirdre Murphy, so we knew the technique was pretty straightforward. We contacted EnviroDNA, and under their guidance, we set up a pilot program for January and February this year. The testing procedure is actually quite simple. You go to your sample site and you fill up a syringe with river water. You then force the water through a filter, which traps the DNA of any organisms that have been in contact with the water. You then repeat those steps several times until you can get no more water forced through the filter. It's usually a volume of somewhere between 2 and 3 litres in our river. You then inject the sample with preservative, bag it up and send it off to the lab for analysis. They then keep all your samples over a period of time and analyse them in a single batch. We took samples on 3 different occasions at 3 different sites along our river. Site WR1 is in the estuary, near our fishing platform, the same spot where E.coli Shire take their weekly water quality samples. Of course, the river wanders around a bit over the beach, so it's not precisely the same location every time. WR2 is our control site up in the national park, where it's free of human interference. There's no infrastructure up there except the ruins of an old concrete weir. WR03 was our intermediate site, just where the river enters the Big Four Caravan Park, immediately downstream from the cow paddock. And here too, Erina and Keith are demonstrating how to do it in these photographs. So as Darren said, there's a lot of potential candidates who could be causing pollution and be the source of our E. coli enterococci problems. We've got a lot of ducks, particularly in the caravan park and in the paddock upstream. And they've previously been blamed as for bacterial pollution. The thing about the ducks, though, is their population is relatively stable, whereas the human population and the E. coli levels rocket up and down all the time. But there's certainly a potential candidate. Then we also have cows. As Darren mentioned, they're quite a serious source of pollution. These are in the cow paddock up the back of the Big Four Caravan Park, and they have a shocking habit of pooing really close to the fence line, which is about 20 metres away from the river. So they're an obvious candidate. We've also got a lot of kangaroos and other wildlife. These big daddies and their big mob live up in the cow paddock and in the forest around there, up the back of the township. We also have many dogs who love to play and swim in the stream. This is my naughty boy enjoying himself actually at our waterwatch site. So we've got plenty of candidates for pollution. Sorry. We initially chose to test for the contamination from humans, cattle and ducks, as they're the most likely suspects, with the lab using qPCR testing, which is quite similar to COVID testing, which would give the most quantitative results. Unfortunately, the PCR test for duck eDNA didn't work, so we had to add a second type of testing, metabarcoding, which shows all the vertebrate species that are shedding DNA into the water. Finally, in June, we got the report from EnviroDNA. It showed humans as a major source of eDNA and contamination. We sent the report on to the agencies involved, the Great Ocean Road Coast and Parks Authority, GORCAPA, to the EPA, to Colac Otway Shire, and to Corangamite CMA. And this is how we summarised it for them. Humans are the main source of contamination, with peak human contamination in January. Ducks are an additional source of contamination, and dogs are small contributors. There's a gradient of contamination from upstream to downstream, with the highest levels occurring in the estuary. And this is good news. None of our samples showed any sign of contamination from cattle, and we also couldn't find any trace of kangaroo or wallaby contamination. And then the good news, as a result of our meta-barcoding, we identified 9 species of native fish in the river, and also platypus and ricali. So we were pretty excited to find the platypus eDNA. Great news. So once the agencies heard about it, we got an almost immediate response. GORCAPA organised a meeting with the other agencies to work out how they could follow up on our findings. They agreed that EPA would conduct a monitoring and compliance program to try to establish the sources of contamination, and that COS will conduct an education campaign targeted at residents and property owners. They also clarified that the EPA are responsible for regulating wastewater quality from the 3 major businesses in the township, the pub and the 2 caravan parks, while COS is responsible for the smaller premises, the store and cafe and the CFA and the private properties. We were very excited to get the response. Finally, we're being taken seriously and some action proposed on our long-standing concerns. However, we decided that to keep the issue moving, we needed to do some more eDNA testing over winter to establish baselines for next summer and to shed more light on the role of the ducks. We've collected samples in August, September and October and are now awaiting results from the lab. We're adding an indicator of fecal contamination to our testing regime, as Darren was talking about. Since the initial response from GORCAPA, we've been asking a lot more questions of the agencies, not only about the sources of contamination, but trying to get some clarity about who is responsible for what. It's been like going down a rabbit warren, but here are some of the things we found out. Oh, lost my next few notes. Yeah. Our attempts to meet with representatives of EPA and COS who are going to do the on-ground work so that we can share local knowledge were stymied by their superiors. We've been told we can only be involved in meetings organised by GORCAPA and attended by all the agencies involved. We're still waiting for a meeting date. The wastewater treatment plant at the beachfront campground is due for replacement. GORCAPA revealed that the existing plant had been unable to cope with the volumes of sewage in peak periods over the summer holidays. While they've said there's no evidence of the plant causing contamination, the issue occurred at the same time as peak E. coli levels and maximum human contamination in the estuary. The new treatment plant for that campground will be able to process up to 35,000 litres per day and will produce Class C recycled water. Class C water is permitted to have up to 1,000 E. coli organisms per 100 mil, well above the trigger point of 260 organisms per 100 mil for closing the estuary. As far as we can make out, the new treatment plant connected to the existing effluent field under the caravan park, this area here, which is just a few metres away from the estuary. The Wye River Beach, the hotel, the pub, is the only business in the township with an actual EPA discharge licence. They are allowed to discharge up to 40,000 litres a day onto the ocean road and onto the beach, with an average of 200, but again a maximum of 1,000 E. coli organisms per 100 mil. The other major business, the Big Four holiday park, there's no public information on how much or what quality of effluent the Big Four holiday park can produce. only that they must maintain an area of 1.1 hectares for effluent disposal. Their effluent is sprayed on the paddock at the back of the park, the same area frequented by the cows, the kangaroos and the ducks. The riparian strip seems to be doing a great job in keeping cow and kangaroo DNA out of the river. Let's hope we can rely on it to contain the effluent as well. Still, our questions keep on coming. For example, are numbers in the campsites capped to meet the capacity of their treatment plants? What happens if there's an expansion in numbers? For example, our Big Four campsite has recently built some safari tents and a new toilet block to service them, which means that more people will be staying more often. Can their treatment plant keep up? Who checks up on this? How are discharge license conditions monitored? And can the private septic systems and treatment plants keep up with increased property occupancy in the age of Airbnb? What's the overlap of responsibility between the EPA and the Shire? We're grateful that COS do the testing and put the signs up, but is this enough? Why are we the ones who had to take the lead on identifying sources of pollution and pay for the initial testing? Isn't it their job? Our pollution issues are common in small towns all along the road, all along the coast, and our progress is being followed by other groups, particularly through the Great Ocean Road Community Network. We've taken the lead in trying to get answers about the sources of pollution in our rivers and action to deal with them, and questions about monitoring, regulation and planning for the future. We'll keep going until we have answers and some clarity and some action so that our beautiful estuary is swimmable all the time. I'd like to close by saying thank you to the Community Association Committee who have driven this project along, especially Greg Hocking, Peter Christoph, and our indefatigable Secretary, Anne Conrick. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions arising. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. That is a great presentation and history of what's been happening in Wye River. And I can see there's a few people clapping. And is that you, Darren? Have you got your hand up for a question?
I was attempting to find the clap symbol.
Oh,
sorry.
It can get very confusing. So I've just got a quick question, Juliet. So with the pub, where are they pumping their effluent or their treated water? Does that go into the estuary as well, or just further down and onto the beach?
It's the edge of depending on where the river is. Sometimes it's actually at the very mouth of the river. Sometimes it's on the beach beyond the mouth. Because the river wanders around so much, at times it goes straight into the lagoon and at times it doesn't.
Mm.
Right now, I think it's well away from its rivers on the opposite side of the beach.
Okay, really interesting. I can see that Lachlan's got a question. So Lachlan, if I can, I'm just going to see if I can unmute you. Oh, here we go. Lachlan, is your mic working? No, we can't hear you. What I might get you to do, Lachlan, if you can type your message in the chat. But in the meantime, this is probably a question for Darren. Have you seen that question from Neil in the chat? So
I'm right now, Justine.
Oh, sorry, Lee.
Yeah.
Lachlan, go ahead.
Juliet, I just wondered whether anyone has looked at enterococci in the actual ocean, and also you had to spend a lot of money doing the eDNA studies. Would it have been helpful if you had the Hector equipment that was mentioned earlier, the automated equipment?
Might ask Darren for his opinion on that one. It's a really interesting question of what sort of testing do you do? We weren't actually able to test directly for E. coli from the different animals. I had to test for the present, who are the lead sources of contamination, we weren't actually doing fecal sampling, so we couldn't answer that question. But we could say, these are the contamination loads are coming from these sources. That's what we could do through eDNA. It's not cheap, I can tell you that. We as a community association having to stump up the cash to do it. So we're quite restricted in that sense. We haven't got a lot of money to spend on it. So, but we didn't have access to those kinds of gadgets that Darren was talking about, which would have been great. Going to the lab is not really an issue. We've got people coming up and down to Melbourne all the time, so that wasn't too hard. And the EnviroDNA have been extremely helpful, and I think a number of other community groups are beginning to approach them to do similar types of testing in different situations.
Yeah,
Thanks, Juliet.
Yeah, I was just say for something like Tector, it's obviously it just looks at E. coli and enterococci, so yeah, it obviously doesn't look at the fecal sources side of things, but yeah, obviously they can be handy devices, but they come with costs associated with them. I mean, hopefully in the future there'll be devices that'll help you detect human sources. There's kind of desktop devices for that, but they're still quite specialized in terms of how you use them. They're quite precise and not kind of easy to use.
Yeah.
But
I mean, that's the thing about the EnviroDNA test use. It is relatively straightforward for non-technical people such as us. I mean, obviously we've been trained up through our waterwatch connections. We knew how to do it, but it's relatively straightforward and simple for community groups to use.
I'll say oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think there was a question there about what's the water quality like at the beaches. Yeah, at the beach, essentially, I'm not sure if there's data around that, but all I can kind of say to that is there has been some sampling done. I think it was maybe around 2009-10 by EPA along surf coast beaches, and generally speaking, it found that the water quality was pretty good because it's there's a lot of dilution in open coast beaches, so it doesn't the water quality tends to be a lot better with the dilution factor essentially. So
Thanks,
Darren, there's also a question that I asked of you previously. Have you got an estimate of the cost of those portable devices?
yeah, I mean well, yes and no. So like I know the Fluidian one that I talked about, it's being hired for roughly $5,000 for like 4 months or something like that, but don't quote me on it. I haven't got. Then that was the Lifesaving Club who got that quote, but yeah, I mean you're looking anywhere between $20,000 to $40,000 for like a Tector or something along those that range. So it's quite a lot of money. But also you can keep it for a long time, and then the consumables, the cost is really, really low. So the cost per sample, analysis is really, really low. But yeah, the upfront costs can be quite expensive, obviously. So
did you say the hire was 5,000?
Well, that's the big desktop one that takes multiple samples essentially, and then the smaller ones, which can take 2 to 4 samples, might be more on that $20,000 type range. It's still a lot of money. Still a lot of money.
Hire 20,000.
Oh no, to buy.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I talk about hiring. Like you can, Floridian were allowing a Lifesaving Club to hire one for 4 months for 5,000 roughly.
Okay.
But yeah, purchasing it is different. As 20,000 for a smaller one, essentially 40,000 for those bigger ones that take more samples at any one time. So
Very interesting. There's a message here from Patrick saying, this is I suppose for you, Darren, are there ways of more accurately tracking down the source? For example, private septic systems were mentioned. Can they be assessed? And also curious if you have any advice for Juliet on her advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, like I have to be a little bit careful along those lines, but I guess my observation, just I haven't been involved with Wye River community group or with the meetings to date, but I think it's good that Colac Otway Shire have been doing monitoring. I think it's for more than 1 year. They probably have multiple years of monitoring. So I think that's good, because obviously not every recreational water quality body in Victoria has that. So that's a good kind of starting point. Also, it's great work what the community have done. They've taken that extra step. I think that some of the work, I think that the Otway Shire and EPA have agreed to around, I think with the septic tanks, like education type programs is good. And I know EPA's got like a large permissions compliance program coming up in the next few months for Wye River. So looking at those businesses obviously in a bit more detail. So I think, that's the positive side of this. Obviously, just from my experience anyway, we've had recreational waters, whether it be kind of rivers or beaches, trying to get a fix for any kind of issues is not necessarily a quick thing to do. And so, it does take a bit of work to try and determine what the sources are. But I think the fact that you've got EPA and the council on side, and they've making commitments to do these compliance programs like for your river catchment, and looking at education programs for the septic tank, I think that's a step, certainly a step in the right direction. But as with most situations like this, is not an overnight fix. Obviously, it does take a bit of time to go and do that work. So yeah, that's just from my observation, from what I've seen so far. I think it's really good to have that commitment from a couple of agencies. I think you've done great work on that front. So
yeah. Well, it took a lot of work for us to get to that point, but that was really the point I'm trying to make. The thing about the E.coli, it's great that they're doing what they're doing. In previous years, when it was only once a month or so, then the issue was the sign would go up and then it would stay there for several weeks, and nobody knew whether it was still current or not. So it's actually great to have a finer scale of monitoring, keep it on, have a tighter time frame to it, so that the sign is actually current, and also to have an arrangement with somebody with the management of the foreshore campground to actually take the sign up and down according to what the E.coli levels was. So they've been much more responsive in that respect. And I know that Otway are well, they don't do it in Lorne, on the Surf Coast Shire doesn't do it. So we're really fortunate to have a council that's been relatively proactive, but it's taken considerable effort from us as a community group to get to the next step of actually trying to work out, well, okay, we're contaminated. Where's that coming from? And that's we've had to give that push to make that happen. And that to us is the kind of missing bit, is what happens next after you've identified you've got contamination. What are we going to do about it? That's the piece that we've been concerned about for a number of years, and that's what we're hoping to actually get to.
Yeah, I think you've done great work to this point, and I recognise all the challenges, and it's certainly been, for a long time, it's been a gap in terms of clear roles and responsibilities of who does what. Unfortunately, it's not in law anywhere or guidance, and so that does make things a little bit more difficult, obviously, and that presents its own challenges. So
yeah, and I mean, that's probably also our question to the kind of the network of responsible agency, the CMA, the EPA, the Shire, the councils, whoever it is, it's taken us considerable effort to work out who's responsible for what. We've been, again, asking this question for a long time, and every step we get a little bit more clarity. But groups shouldn't have to do all the work to do this, to find it out. It should be kind of mapped out before we get there.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yes, certainly a gap that needs to be addressed, definitely.
We are, we've reached time. It's 1 hour in the webinar now, but there are quite a few questions coming up. So for those of you who'd like to stay on and to listen to the questions that we're going to ask, Darren and Juliet, have you got time to stay on to keep answering questions?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I might just throw to Barbara. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's a segue from what Juliet's actually. I'm Barbara, and I'm in the Surf Coast Shire, and we've done the similar sort of work that Juliet has with the Pancalac estuary. And we got to the point of identifying that we had an E.coli, an enterococci problem after dry. And we got to the point of meeting with the agencies that Juliet has outlined. And unfortunately, in our case, the EPA reps and the Shire don't want to do any testing. So this gets to be very problematic if there's no agency that says it will do the testing. We, of course, will probably do it ourselves, but if you get a no, then you really are at the base point of who is responsible for the health of the waters. And Darren, I wonder if your responsibility is for the beach and in partnership for the Yarra, is it not the EPA's responsibility to have a role in terrestrials of monitoring?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously we're going to work on communicating what we think our role and responsibilities are around recreational water quality. I mean, it's kind of obviously a lot of stuff we I guess where we've kind of stepped in is a lot of it's historical, essentially. But in terms of recreational water quality and monitoring around Victoria, yeah, we don't have a law or, like I said, or a guidance to point to, but generally speaking, it's a lot of the work is done by public land managers who are probably best positioned to do that. But and that's what I guess that's what we'd point towards. But yeah, I do recognise there's no guidance or law around that. So but our role and responsibility really is kind of we've got Beachport and EstuaryWatch, which have been long-standing, they've been with us for a long time, and that's what we look after. And we're kind of looking at trying to make sure that the best science and communication best practices used around Victoria, where there is recreational water quality monitoring, which does happen, but not everywhere, obviously. But yeah, one of the challenges, even for us, is we don't have any kind of clear guidance or laws to point to say, well, who's responsible for what. So at this stage,
how could we? Because obviously we're not going to be the only estuary, many are. So where can we put a push to get new legislation to actually have an agency have to take a responsibility? Because we'd all be behind that.
Mm-hmm.
And that would surely be a role for EPA to take a lead in this.
Well, I mean, it's I guess I'll kind of happy to get back to on that one in terms of where it might be best to kind of feed that information through, because I'm keen for it, like to be fed through to somewhere. I just don't want to kind of give you the the wrong agency or stuff like that. I think it kind of it can come down to who's the best agency to provide that guidance or policy essentially on who does what, and in terms of roles and responsibilities. So but yeah, no, I'll capture that. I mean, I'm happy to try and get back to you on that one. Great. So yeah,
Justine can make the connection.
Yeah.
Yes, I can definitely do that. We've got a few questions about. Maybe we'll just do one more question. It says, Darren, what should happen when an extremely high sample like 24,000 is recorded, such as what happened at Wye River in January?
Well, obviously, for that one, I mean, that's very, very high. And obviously, at the very base level, you'd be wanting to have signage and communication for people not to hop in the water. That 24,000, that might even be, and I don't have access to the results or know the full details around it, but sometimes labs can have like a upper detection limit. They have lower detection limits of less than 10. Sometimes they won't go below that, depending on the type of analysis that's been done. And then they might have it for 24,000 as well. So it could have, it may have even be higher than 24 hours for 24,000 for all I know. I don't know. Julie, I know you put your hand up there, but like so that I'm just kind of
I'm able to unmute my we questioned that one, so we were concerned about it. It did seem extremely high, and we wondered, and also it was matching, and it was high at Kennet River the same week, so not as bad as ours. But so we did ask the Shire, well, is there a limit on what your lab can come up with? And they said no, as far as we're aware, that's a real reading. So something that clearly happened that particular week. I mean, as we saw from the graph, the readings are extremely variable. They go up and down quite rapidly. From week to week, they can be quite different from each other. And I mean, again, that's something with the eDNA testing. We found that different samples taken at the same spot at the same time could yield quite differing results. So there's obviously a lot of variation in the water that flows past your syringe when you're sucking it up.
Yeah.
So so that but it, as far as we could ascertain, that was a genuinely extremely high result.
So it wasn't like a at the
Wasn't
upper
it
detection
wasn't
limit.
a wasn't a sampling error as far as I did say we did check with them was what had happened.
Yeah, because sometimes we get like a result might be greater than 24 hours. 20 greater than 20. I'm hearing myself speak. Get greater than 24,000 result, and it could actually be a lot higher than that. So, but yeah, you get a lot of variability. Obviously, no one should be coming into contact with that type of levels in the water. And I guess it'd be interesting to know too, like with the sampling, are they going out at the same day and time each week?
Well, that's always the thing, is it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think they're doing it, trying to do it fairly regularly, but there's always little glitches. They do it on a Tuesday morning or something where it's not a kind of peak weekend. I mean, that was always one of our questions about the testing that's done on the effluent from the pub. It would be very different at peak period on Saturday nights to what it would be on Wednesday lunchtime. So it's the timing of the thing is obviously very important.
And that's where too, like it's kind of hard with those single samples too, because it might be that they're taking it to the lab to get analysed. I assume that's what's happening, and then you get a result 24 hours later.
That's right.
By the time you get the result, maybe any kind of whatever may have caused that is gone.
Exactly.
And it might actually be the next, even though you don't have a sample for the next day, it might be gone back down to lowish levels or be much lower.
Yeah.
So obviously that's where it's good to kind of look at that longer data set you've got, and I think having the agencies kind of looking at the potentially high, those potential sources that could be contributing human pollution, and doing inspections, educations around that is probably a good approach.
Yeah.
It is hard to chase up on. We find it hard. We get like one really high result, we'll go out the next day and it's back down below, and there's no evidence. So chasing up on single results is really difficult, but certainly the communication aspect is really important once you find that result.
The thing about the monitoring is it shows a trend of unacceptable pollution levels above those, well above the environmental reference standards over virtually the whole summer. So I mean, the peaks are one thing, but we've got a very persistent problem which is not going away.
Yep.
I might ask you a question, Juliet. So for other community members who might be going through the same thing as you, if you were to do this project again or to encounter this this problem in a different town, how would you approach it differently? Is there anything you do?
Well, I do the sanitary inspection that Darren was mentioning. So that was a tool that we didn't know about. So which I think, if that's publicly available, that would actually be really helpful. So that you could actually, look around and say, okay, what are our potential sources of pollution? The other issue about it is, with the trying to sort out where your main sources of contamination are. And the fact that the duct test didn't work terribly well for us, we would probably designed the program a little bit differently had we known that was going to be the case. But you've got to start somewhere. You've got to look at what as locals do you feel is the problem? We all had our pet suspects. And do we think that we need to devise some sort of program to think, well, can we sort this out? And can we provide enough data to the agencies, as we've done, to get them interested in it? So then they will take carriage of it and do more work. So I mean, that's the thing. We as a community association, I think we started the ball rolling on this, and now we're really hoping, that by interesting the agencies in the issue, that then they'll take it up, do more testing, which is beyond our capacity to afford. As Darren said, $20,000, one of those fancy meters, unless we all club together and have one for the whole coast, so which would then be very useful. We just don't have the resources to do it ourselves. So that's why, we've got to get a hook and say, okay, here's what we think the problem is. Here's what we've discovered. And then, you guys go figure it out and do something about it.
Yeah. And Darren, from you, if a community is just starting out, what's the most rigorous way? You're saying the single samples don't tell you much of a story, but for you, your advice for communities if they're starting out on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think, firstly try to engage with your public land manager and whoever that may be. Also, that can vary around the state, essentially. So it might be Gorkappa, Gratian Road Authority, essentially, who are the public land managers for the Surf Coast, but it'll be councils for other areas. And also you've got Parks Vic land, and you got waterways and stuff like that. But yeah, kind of, I guess, learn who's your public land manager. I think they're probably a good starting point. In terms of there are resources like the sanitary inspection, for example, that you can kind of are quite easy to use, I think, from a community perspective, just to try to understand what the sources might be, even if you don't necessarily have water quality sampling results, is a good starting point. I think so. That's something you can do. It doesn't really kind of cost anything. And that's probably the first two starting steps, really. Engage with your public land manager, whoever that might be, a council, or might be Gratian Road Committee, or whoever it is, essentially. And yeah, and EPA, we're happy to share that sanitary inspection as well, just to kind of understand, maybe there's not many sources at all, or maybe the sources are natural. Might, if you have a sanitary inspection, it might kind of give you some background around that as well, or might identify that there might be potentially quite a lot of potential spots of human source pollution, for example. So that's probably the starting point I'd probably recommend. So
Valerie's asking, are these tests carried out in other parts of Victoria? There are many rivers and lakes used for recreation. Do you know, Juliet and Darren, if other communities or the EPA is testing in other areas?
I mean, I'm aware of the Oven River pools up around Bright. So you've got Alpine Shire. They actually use, as I said, I think as you said in the presentation, they're using Tector around there. That's the Shire doing the sampling around there. But there's not a huge amount of recreational water quality monitoring around Victoria, to be honest with you. I mean, Parks Victoria were doing some around Listerfield Lake, which is kind of like outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, if you like. But yeah, apart from that, there's not a huge amount going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think Carlisle Otway's been quite proactive in testing at Wye River, Kennet River, and the recreational lakes around Colac as well. I think that was actually where they started. The people up there were wondering about their water quality, and it's a model which other shires and councils could follow. It's really valuable from the community perspective, and I think the Beach Watch and Yarra Watch sites, it's great to have at least a prediction of what the water quality is going to be like. If not, actually, if that could be extended down the coast, kind of the models of what water quality is going to be like in more locations. I mean, as I understand it, a lot of the monitoring is done in response to some event, something's happened, and then they go out and monitor it rather than doing the predictive, kind of baseline monitoring that Yarra Watch and Beach Watch do.
Well, we don't know what will happen. Maybe there'll be an expansion of recreational water quality around Victoria, hopefully. But how that looks, who does it, we don't know. But I know at our end, from a science perspective, we're developing new site-specific forecast models that could be used anywhere, essentially, in the state. And we're looking at having a new map that'll be more of a Victorian, that would allow other sites to be kind of displayed, but we're doing things like that too, and the site-specific standards that we're talking about, so that we're not just assuming that it's human pollution everywhere. So we're doing things in the back, I guess. We are kind of trying to, I guess, do things around that like that, but also there's no solid plans around kind of expansion of recreational water quality. But we're preparing if it does happen, in terms of, because I think ultimately people would like to see forecast, models, good for your poor, at their water bodies. Probably that's where people, would like to see. So we kind of, we're doing some work in the background around that, but yeah.
All right, I think we might leave it there. We've gone 15 minutes over time. So I really want to thank you both, Darren and Juliet, for presenting today, and everybody who tuned in. It's really great to see that you're keen to learn from these case studies, and there'll be more webinars coming from EstuaryWatch and WaterWatch that are relevant for communities. So we'll leave the webinar there, and thank you everybody for attending, and especially to our presenters.
Pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
Justine.
you.